Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Case, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is very, very special. I'm continuing the theme of science fiction, fantasy, and philosophy, just Trojan horsing in a bunch of philosophy into science fiction and such. Some of you will be upset by that. I don't care that much. Nerds are nerds. We're going to nerd out on science fiction, nerd out on philosophy and fantasy. I'm really excited because I have with me Christopher Ruocchio, the author of the Sun Eater series. He's awesome. Third time back already. We're becoming fast friends. And then Jordan from iWizard. And this is our third time talking as well. So the perfect three is here. It's going to be awesome. Before we jump in, I want to thank everyone who's making this podcast happen over on Patreon. If you guys like this pod, if it's your top 5, top 10 favorite, then please consider becoming a Patreon patron. You can also become a YouTube member, same perks over here on YouTube if you're watching there. And there's a bunch of ways that I can commodify myself, but I won't. Just check the links in the description. I give you all sorts of discounts on leather goods. I have a weird obsession with leather notebooks and such. And you can too. So check out my links in the description. Without further ado, though, let's jump in with these two and talk about science fiction, fantasy, and philosophy. Jordan, Christopher, thanks so much for both you guys coming back on the podcast here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
It's a
glad to be
pleasure.
here.
There we go. Boom. Awesome. I don't know, Christopher, is there a lag? Or are you with us here?
I seems fine to me. Is there a lag
Might
on your
there
end?
might be a little tiny one. I think there might be a tiny one, but that's all right. We'll make it work. No worries, man. For those who don't know, I mean, if you guys listen to my podcast, you should know these two by now. But maybe we could just start off with quick introductions. I gave a little tiny one, but Christopher, can you tell us like who are you? What do you do for a living?
Yeah. So my name is Christopher Ruocchio. I'm a science fiction writer. I've written 6 novels now, 3 short novels. I call them novellas, but that's a lie. And a couple dozen short stories. I also very briefly wrote for Marvel Comics, which was fun. But everything except for the one Marvel Comics story has been in one universe. It's a science fantasy setting called Sun Eater, which is very much in the tradition of Star Wars, of Dune. Very heavily influenced by Gene Wolfe, and by, of course, writers like Tolkien and over on the fantasy side of things. I like to say it's a science fantasy story. It's got elements of both. So if you like either, it might be a good fit for you.
Yeah, man. Well, didn't you just have one in is it Galaxy that they're bringing back? Y-
Oh yeah, I just wrote my first fantasy story in Galaxy Magazine. Yeah, Galaxy Magazine is coming back. They kept the old numbering system, so it's an issue 263. My first
Nice.
ever fantasy piece is in that. If you want to check that out,
It, is that
it's
in
free
a
to read
different
on galaxysf.com.
is that a different universe than
Yeah,
Sun
yeah,
Eater?
yeah.
Nice.
Yeah,
Awesome.
it's all new. It's its own thing. It's I didn't quite figure out how to talk about it yet, but it's very much like very much in like the Conan sword and sorcery kind of vein,
Oh,
but it's got a little bit of a spin to it. A little bit of a spin to it.
nice. I think I downloaded it. I think you shared it somewhere. I have it, I believe, but I haven't read it yet. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I hope you like it when you do.
Yeah,
Is that the
definitely.
one I edited or like that I gave a little bit of feedback to?
Yeah, the
Right,
Barrow
right.
King. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I sent
Okay.
it to you.
Nice. Well, Jordan, how about you, man? Can you give us a quick elevator pitch on who you are?
I'm Jordan Hill. I run the channel iWizard with my wife. I have my bachelor's degree in philosophy. I decided a little bit later to become a teacher. So I'm a full-time high school teacher. I teach the older kids at an advanced math and science academy. I teach English, AP English, philosophy, rhetoric. I teach a course called Fantasy and Sci-Fi Literature. It's called From Wizards to Wormholes.
Mm.
And I teach a film and philosophy class where we do works of sci-fi like, Spielberg's Artificial Intelligence and Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey and Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Truman Show, all those kind of like the intersection between film and philosophy. I teach that with a colleague of mine. My wife and I are working on a fantasy novel that we just got edits back for, so we're working on that, and yeah, that's about it. So
That's awesome, man. I love that. That class sounds awesome. From wizards to wormholes. That's like everything right up my alley. I have because of talking with Christopher and reading his books, I started writing science fiction short stories again. And mine's called Sages, Mages, and Wisdom Machines because I'm trying to pull all that stuff together. But I mean, it's so much inspired by Christopher's science fantasy and like him opening my eyes to all that kind of stuff. So
Oh, geez. Well,
They're
thanks.
good, man. They're good.
thank,
I've read some of them. They're very good.
thanks, man. I appreciate that. I get to LARP with you too, so that's kind of fun. You guys are like real authors, and I get to pretend that I'm one as
Not
well.
yet.
No, there
Almost.
are no real authors. The real authors are all dead.
That's awesome. Well, I wanted to ask you guys something I've been kind of pondering on is like what's the good of science fiction and fantasy? Because I have Tolkien in my head, and he's like, it's escapism, and that's okay, and that's good, and we need that. Well, I mean, he didn't say escapism, right? But that's kind of how it gets. But it's like a pejorative on it. And I'm in my head, I'm like, it's gotta be. It can't just be like mere escape, right? Like, because I'm the guy who wants to teach lessons in my stuff. I'm pretty like heavy-handed in all my stuff. I know that's not a great way to write, but I wanted to get thoughts from you guys. Like, what is the good of it? Is it okay that it's just escapism, or is it something else? Should every science fiction and fantasy story have a deeper moral lesson that people are inculcated with?
Yeah, well, I think the escapism is a good place to start, right? Because I do think that the pressures of life can become so overwhelming in certain ways, and having a release valve somewhere else. I mean, this has been the function of drama, all the way back, right? This is
Hmm.
partly why the Greeks performed tragedies in the first place, right? You know, we talked about catharsis and all of that. And there is a deeper function, right? Even to those ancient stories, and sometimes especially to those ancient stories, right? And for those ancient people, the stories had a deeper focus too, right? There is a religious element to story, even in our broadly post-religious sort of climate. There's a deeper meaning to our existence that we all know exists, even if we deny it to, practically speaking in our day-to-day lives. Or even by, there are people who say there's no meaning, but they sure don't act like it, right? Um, and in fantasy and science fiction in particular, I think that sort of symbolic world can be concretized in a way that it's more symbolic in other stories. I think a lot about. I'm a big Thomas Harris fan. I like Hannibal Lecter, and there is a dragon in Red Dragon, but it just doesn't literally breathe fire, right? So that's sort of more abstract, but it's better if the dragon, I think, is literal and is flying around and is burning down, thatch-proof cottages and the like. I think in fantasy especially, but in science fiction to an extent, because they're broadly the same thing, right? We sort of are able to touch on this symbolic level of our reality, in a more literal way. Um, and I think that that is very, very valuable, beyond the mere escapism, because we're escaping in a certain sense to a world that feels truer, I think, in
Mhm.
certain ways, than our own life. Somehow a world of kings and knights and castles is more solid than a world of boardrooms and bank accounts. And so I think it's useful in that sense to find pieces of who we would like to be, if not who we are, in these other stories. I hope that
Mm.
makes sense. It doesn't sound
No,
too, you know.
I think it was great. Jordan, you got thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess so. I think I would go back to like what initially draws me to speculative fiction. Um, as a philosophy guy, and I know you're interested in this, Parker, I just have always found that more is possible with with a genre like science fiction, that more is possible with a genre like fantasy. So I'll give you an example of this in the real world, and you'll have something to say about this, Parker. But in the real world, what it seems to mean to be a philosopher in 2024 is to be like a university professor who is constantly in meetings and advising students and scheduling and you teach several courses and you're expected to publish, and it's this very sanitized kind of unromantic. In fantasy literature, a philosopher is a sorcerer. A
Mm.
philosopher is a wizard. A philosopher is the village shaman or whatever. So I do agree with Christopher when he says, in some sense, uh, fantasy literature makes everything a little bit more real. I think sci-fi can do that as well. It is it is often it comes out across as a little overly didactic or ham-fisted when novelists like Ayn Rand try to explore philosophical and political ideas in fiction. Um, there's something that feels very much more natural when we try to do this in something like science fiction. You look at like a novel like The Dispossessed, exploring anarchy with Ursula Le Guin, or um, many sci-fi novels will explore the nature and limits of consciousness, or where artificial intelligence is going to go, extrapolating out from where we are now and predicting, in some sense, what we think the future holds in store for us. And I think that's actually very important to the beginning of how science fiction emerged and why it emerged over time, going all the way back to the pulps. And I know science fiction goes back way further than that. Some people say, oh, it's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is the first science fiction novel. And then that turns into H.G. Wells and Journey to the Center of the Earth, Jules Verne, and all of that. That's the birth of science fiction. Some people argue it goes all the way back to Homer's Odyssey, right? Which
Yeah.
I think is a big stretch. Other people, like Nabokov, said it goes all the way back to Shakespeare's The Tempest. I disagree with. I think those claims are a bit ludicrous. But you can go all the way back to the kind of rugged American individualism that defined the pulp era. By the 1930s, the last frontiers of Earth had been explored. They'd been mapped, and there was a sense, right? We had explored to some degree. We knew very much about astronomy. We'd been everywhere there was to see. We'd explored the interior of Africa. We'd discovered Tahiti, and you know we'd pretty much we'd taken to the skies. We kind of knew about the stratosphere, uh, et cetera, et cetera. The um, there became a yearning for new vistas. It seemed that the real frontiers had been closed off, and so science fiction was an attempt. Early science fiction was an attempt to create new frontiers, um, boldly going where no one had gone before, to use the Star Trek line. But so I think that was part of the early impetus for science fiction, is the idea that the world began to feel smaller, and science fiction was a way of imagining a much bigger world. There's a great I brought this because I didn't know 100% what you wanted to talk about, but there's a great definition of science fiction that is from the University of Pittsburgh professor. I think her name is Alicia Bashara Bondo, but I saved the quote here, and
Mm.
she says, science fiction is the genre that considers what strange new beings we might become, what mechanical forms we might invent for our bodies, what networks and systems might nourish or tap our life energies, and what machine shells might contain our souls. And that is a very sort of uh, almost utopian, like, materialist, like, definition of science fiction. So I know that, you could have other definitions, but I think to some degree she's right. I think there's an anxiety about what's happening to us and what might happen to us. Last thing I'll say, Ridley Scott, the director, I don't know if you guys ever saw this program. He came out with a television series called The Prophets of Science Fiction. I think it was in the mid aughts. And it was all about how we tend to think that um, we tend to think that science science fiction is inspired by science. And once scientists develop new technologies, once they innovate, once they discover new things, oh, then science fiction authors come along and write about that and push it to its limits. His argument in this series, and he starts with Mary Shelley, is that in fact, science fiction authors inspire scientists to do what they do. That the science fiction authors are the dreamers, and then
Mm.
scientists are actually coming along behind them and filling in the gaps. And so I would recommend anyone watching to take a look at that television show. But so I'll leave it there. That's kind of a network of loose, disorganized observations.
Oh, that's
Um,
so good, dude. I love that. Uh, one thing for me, I have like an that was super helpful actually. I have this ad hoc definition of fantasy and of a bifurcation between fantasy and SF, which I like to call because now I'm on the inside, so I say SF instead of sci-fi, unless it's on TV or something, and it's like the sci-fi trash. Um, and
I
mine is
know.
like I find inspiration from fantasy, and when I read science fiction, it's usually don't do this. That's like the science. I don't know a whole ton of science fiction protagonists I want to emulate, but I know a whole bunch of fantasy folks where I'm like, yes, that's me. I want to be him. So like yesterday I was going to or 2 days ago, I was going to a jujitsu tournament. I was super sick and I felt terrible. And I always review matches, in my head a ton, way too much, like ruminating over them. I'm trying to get out of my head. I'm listening to a bunch of the old Conan ones, the old Conan short stories. I'm like, bro, I'm gonna be Conan. That's just it. I'm just gonna imagine that I'm Conan. I'm gonna LARP as him, and I'm gonna get through this. But I would never do that with, like, Gully Foyle. I would never do that with, any science fiction character. I'm like, those I would never, like, think about grokking or anything like that, So I don't know if that's a does that distinction, like, play out? Or maybe I just haven't read enough, science fiction and fantasy to, see characters I wanna emulate.
I think that's maybe unfair to science fiction
Yeah.
overall. I do think so. I broadly agree with Jordan's bit of it. Mapping new frontiers and stuff. You do see this in sort of the pulp phase and then into the early golden age of science fiction, right? Which
Mm,
follows after that. That's really the golden age is really what people are thinking of when they say science fiction. They strip out all the big properties, right? They're thinking of Asimov and Clarke and Heinlein. They're thinking of John W. Campbell. They're not thinking of the pulp era is a lot weirder and a lot more experimental and open in a lot of ways, and so is what comes after with the new wave. But as you get into the new wave, right? Really, and I don't know if this is I think this is really an embodied thing. I think this is down to the authors themselves being different people, right? And the editors themselves being different people. Um, Into the new wave, you start to see this mapping of interiority instead of interior spaces. And you see it's like Frank Herbert, right? Dune is not so much about Arrakis, really, as it is about the human sort of consciousness and will, right? And Paul's sort of strange powers and how that shapes his character and how his character then shapes the world, right? And you see this in writers contemporary Herbert, you see it in Zelazny, and Vance, and you see it in Le Guin. And there's a relationship between the environment and the person, but science fiction does start to concern itself greatly with, like you were saying, what does the future look like for humanity, right? As organisms, as a species, as opposed to like what's out there, what can we conquer? Now that original thread, remains. You got writers like Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle who are, I think, in a lot of ways, a lot more simpatico with that sort of outward facing, let's say, expansion streak in early science fiction. Um, they're more simpatico with like Burroughs than they are with Herbert or Le Guin or something like that. But we've arrived at a point now where science fiction doesn't really exist. There are science fictions, and there are fantasies. They're all these little different competing schools. And so, really, all we're talking about now is a very broad umbrella in which we can, hold a lot of different ideas. And really about as many ideas as there are philosophies, right? Because there's all these little competing schools of what science fiction is or should be. And if you look at the list of books that are up for the Hugo Award, it's quite different from the list of books that are up for the Dragon Award, right? Or is quite different than like what's getting listed for the Clark Award or whatever. And there's this sort of Tower of Babel effect that's happened to the industry just by virtue of its mass and charge. And so it's become a lot of different things. So there are um more character driven science fiction pieces. But I think if you do look at the Golden Age, I think you're right. I think that like Isaac Asimov wouldn't know a character if it punched him in the face.
Okay.
It's just not the kind of writer that he is. Whereas you're reading fantasy of the period, it's going to be a lot more like that. But if you look at other writers that were around the same time, 40s, 50s, you read C.L. Moore or Lee Brackett, like you'll find characters there. Like, but I fancy you could imagine yourself as Northwest Smith.
Hmm.
Is based Indiana Jones. Like, why wouldn't you want to be? Right. So there are those characters. They're out there. But uh but I don't think that impression of science fiction is what culturally dominated through through the golden age, largely because I think John W. Campbell had such an outsized impact on the shaping of what the field was. I mean, he ran Astounding, became analog for decades, and he ran it like very, very didactically.
Mm,
He wouldn't let Asimov put aliens into animation. Like that's a pretty like large editorial overreach from my perspective as an author. But he was like that controlling, and the result of that might be a lot of unhappy authors or variously happy authors. But um, but it was to create an impression of science fiction as a thing, and it was his thing. Now there were competing camps even then, but that was so dominant the vision
mm.
for so long that it's created this cultural sense that that is what science fiction is. We still feel that way. Science fiction is still less widely read than fantasy because people have this impression that it's hard. And it's hard because Campbell wanted it to be technical.
Science fiction.
He wanted it to be science
Mm.
fiction, right? Although that was Gernsback's word, right?
Yes.
But Gernsback had this sense too, right? This is another thing that this literature can do is educate you. And there's still this sense that like what, if you're a parent, right? My parents felt this way, that like really what your kid was getting out of reading these books was an education. And actually,
Mm.
there's a lot of nonsense in science fiction. And in fantasy too, of course, right? But that was how the product was sort of built. Two parents, right? Gernsback especially was trying to find anybody he could with letters after his name or her name,
Yeah.
to fill out his magazine to increase the perceived value of his magazines to parents. So, but the story is written by a doctor, right? It didn't matter that it was a doctor of like entomology, and the story had nothing.
L. Ron Hubbard is a good
Uh,
example of what you're describing.
yeah, well, yes, it's an example of a number of things. But there's, but the point is there's always been a lot of variety within the field, and with regard to not just philosophical background or literary quality, but with regard to artistic intention. Um,
Mm.
some of those stories were purely written to entertain, right? There's not a lot in common between say Princess of Mars and iRobot. Those are quite different books. And to call them, the same thing is often, I think, misleading. Um, but at the same time, too, we were talking. Jordan said something that made me think about that. Somebody I don't remember exactly, um, but I broadly think that science fiction is just fantasy for like a post-religious world, right?
Mm.
Um, we find it a lot harder, find it a lot easier to believe in aliens than we do elves, or for that matter, angels. And so I think that science fiction broadly fills this sort of mythological gap for people who are skeptical of mythology and sort of Trojan horses that sort of need back into their uh, hearts and minds. I don't know if that makes sense.
I
Yeah.
think that makes a lot of sense. I had a mentor who was he's a theologian. He was a C.S. Lewis scholar. Um, he retired from his professorship, and now he just travels around the world talking about C.S. Lewis. It's insane. But sometimes when he's dealing with like a really secular audience, and he wants to talk about the Bible, he'll pitch Revelation as the Book of Revelation as like biblical science fiction, where it's like it's kind of tricky because he's like, well, I don't think it's fiction, but here it's this apocalyptic literature, which is a style of writing in the first century, which is wild and dreamlike and crazy, and it's like if you start talking to people in that way, you can pull down their their hackles come down, and maybe you can get behind their walls and actually listen to the content of the story. And I feel the same way with trying to write from my very limited uh, uh, method, my very limited experience of writing science fiction and fantasy, just for my audience. It's just the back door. I'm like, hey, if I tell you that there's a laser gun here, now you're like, "Hey, that's pretty cool." It's like, "Yeah, but I'm trying to give you this paper that took me 3 years to write that, like, you're gonna get this, but it's through laser guns, so listen up," and I really like going in the back door that way. I think you're right that it's like it is fantasy for a secular world. I don't know, Jordan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and to your question, Parker, which I think is a really good one. I think it just depends what you like, and I actually am not a postmodernist, so I do believe that it does make sense for the sake of kind of having a heuristic to periodize literary history into different movements and being able to sort of chart the zeitgeist and the trends. That makes sense to me, and I have no problem with that. I think Christopher is right. It depends what era of science fiction you're looking at. If you want to go back all the way to Jules Verne and do the new frontier, sort of what's at the center of the earth? How do we get to the moon and what's on the moon? And what's amazing is in Verne's story about going to the moon, he envisions a kind of slingshot that is essentially, or a kind of gun firing you to
Cannon,
the
yes.
moon from like Cape Canaveral or whatever. From that, he predicted that that would actually be the best area to launch someone. For those of you who want a little bit more, want to dive deeper on what Christopher was talking about when he was talking about the pulps, and then the golden age, and then the new wave, and then the golden age redux in the 1990s, and then sort of what we have today in the 21st century. You might want to read a book by Alec Novella Lee called Astounding. Christopher mentioned Astounding Magazine, which was Campbell's magazine. As he said, it eventually became Analog. That's a great book. And that'll teach you everything you need to know about these different periods. But yeah, Parker, it depends what you're interested in. If you want that sort of you know that sort of imaginative tech, that sort of John Carter Mars sort of thing, which is, I think the guy is basically like he's like a an ex Civil War soldier. And so again, it is basically, you take the Native Americans and you send John Carter to Mars and have him with his ray gun killing like aliens.
Mm.
If you want, in the golden age period, you do have the emergence of this kind of heroic figure. It came later to be called the competent man. Heinlein's
Yeah.
new type of protagonist, the competent man, this rugged, technically skilled, polymathic figure who could fix his spaceship, who could defend himself with a ray gun. And this idea is that you have this lone heroic explorer who is patriotic and very competent and has all these sort of rugged manly qualities, who has the skills. It's essentially what's that novel? It was turned into a film with Matt Damon, a- a- about surviving on Mars.
The Martian.
The Martian. It's that sort of person who, when his spaceship breaks down, he can fix his spaceship. He knows how to work on robots. He knows how to do everything, right? He's a jack of all trades. He's a survivalist. Americans love
Mm.
survivalists. Um, I actually wrote an article about this, and one of the quotes I picked up from Heinlein, I'm just scrolling to find it. Heinlein says, this is great. A human being should be able to change a diaper, plan an invasion, butcher a hog, con a ship, design a building, write a sonnet, balance accounts, build a wall, set a bone, comfort the dying, take orders, give orders, cooperate, act alone, solve equations, analyze new problems, pitch manure, program a computer, cook a tasty meal, fight efficiently, die gallantly. Specialization is for insects. And so you're right. You
Wow.
do see a lot of characters that you can you do see a lot of characters that you can heroes that you can admire and try to emulate. And then Christopher is 100% right when he says that when we get to the new wave, we're less engaging in an exploration of outer space and more, there's a turn inward. It's very similar to what you and I were talking about last time we chatted, Parker, about Camus' notion that it's profoundly insignificant whether the earth revolves around the sun or the reverse, and no one died over the ontological argument. It's this idea during the new wave that now we're going to turn inward. We have these things to deal with on earth. We have these social and political concerns, and we're going to use fiction as a vehicle for examining that and also turning inward. You have a real what Philip Reef calls the new psychological man. You have this turn inward, this look at the inner self. And so science fiction during the new wave becomes a study of human nature. When you read, folks like J.G. Ballard and Samuel Delaney and Brian Aldiss and Joanna Russ and Octavia Butler, you read a story of, take Octavia Butler's Speech Sounds. This is a short story. It's a long short story. So it's probably like 20 pages, but it's about this outbreak, this sort of post-apocalyptic scenario where everyone catches this disease, and it is it is a pandemic where you lose either your speech, you lose your hearing, or you lose your ability to read words. It impacts your ability to understand and wield language. And that is an examination not only of what losing even part of your ability to of your facility with language, even losing part of that, what does that do to the human being and how it examines the centrality of language to the human experience. You get a lot of that during the new wave. Thomas M. Dish, that sort of thing. So that's kind of what you're going to get during the new wave. Then you get the sort of Campbellian redux and that sort of thing. And then I think science fiction eventually becomes a little bit broader. It's less about the individual and more about large scale societies. Uh, Christopher, remind me of that series that you really like. I'm not saying you agree with him, but you really like the series. It's a post scarcity society. It's a
Oh,
the
the culture.
culture.
Ian M. Banks. Yeah,
Culture,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Well, yeah.
That's what I'm referring to. Alistair Reynolds is his Revelation Space series. Ian Banks is the Culture series. Science fiction becomes a little bit harder. It becomes about sort of zooming out a little bit and attempting to understand where all of this artificial intelligence, consciousness, will we ever get to anywhere near light speed travel? Um, uh, what sorts of societies is it possible to experiment with? Will they work? Do they accord with human nature? If you have an empire that's spanning over vast distances, what does that do to human beings? Christopher examines that in his fiction. Anyways, I'll stop there. But another rambling network of observations on my part. Maybe you could do something with that,
No,
Parker.
that's so good. I you guys have been kind of, like, going around the modern trends as well in science fiction, and I just wonder, like, where are we at? Christopher, you said there's science fictions, there may not be science fiction anymore. I I I like the pulp. I like the golden age. People like, dog in the golden age a lot, and like, "Oh, if you really like, a tall guy with blonde hair and blue eyes who fights the evil scientist and steals his daughter," like, that sounds cool. I'm okay with that too. Like, they were good authors too, not all of them,
Sure,
right? But
sure, sure.
but, I'm not I like the new wave as well, but I'm going back and starting there and trying to read my way through the Hugos and stuff like that. And I'm scared when I look towards the newer Hugos, like the new Hugo winners, where I'm like, look, I don't know if some of this is like, I know identity politics came through and stuff. I have no idea what's going on with modern stuff. And Jordan, I've heard from you and some of the headaches of publishing or trying to get published in today's milieu and such. Where are we at? Like, what are science fiction stories like nowadays? Because it seems like we could characterize golden age, we could characterize new wave. Is there a name for where we're at right now, and what are the trends going on?
I'll turn this to Christopher. Christopher, you should weigh in on this because you're the expert. I'll only say one quick one sentence response. I know a lot of people have said this. This is an original thought. I think it's everything right now. I think
Hmm.
there really is, especially with the advent of indie publishing. I think all these things that we talked about, I think there's just a lot going on right now. So I know it's kind of cliche, but it's sci-fi and fantasy. They're very diverse right now, in my opinion.
Hmm.
No, I broadly agree. Like I said, there are science fictions, right? So if you want to ask the question of where we are right now, I think the response to that is to ask, where exactly do you mean, right? Because the thing that should be said about all of these sort of movements that Jordan sort of outlined, right, from pulp to golden age and so on, is that we're talking not just about times and places, right? Uh, this is something I wanted to say too about the general appeal of stories as opposed to reading an academic treatise, right? Is that the ideas that those stories are about are incarnate in some way. And this is once again me bullying Parker as a hylomorphist to him, the Platonist, right? Like these ideas, like, they like they hit harder when there's an actual fist, right? And drama provides the fist, right? Character provides the incarnation, right, of these ideas, and places and settings and struggles, right, to play out these ideas, right? And this is true in the real world too. And with these different literary movements within science fiction, these epicycles within the greater cycle that is science fiction, right, as a whole, right? You're talking not just about abstract sort of disembodied things that are just happening of themselves. You're talking about people, right? We're talking about, like I said, John Campbell, right, driving the golden age basically single-handedly with his stable of authors, right, and leaving this huge sort of shadow in this impression. The new wave was new writers, and more than new writers, it was new editors, right? And same too as we get after that. And as the field gets bigger because it's more lucrative, right? There were more editors, and so there were more author stables. We're just talking about traditional houses at the moment, right? And then there were more authors to fill those stables because there were more editors, and those editors all have a vision. For example, now in fantasy, we're looking at a lot of crossover with romance at the moment.
Hmm.
And this is broadly a consequence of the fact that that's what the editors who are buying fantasy right now want to do,
Hmm.
because it's their personal taste. And always, there's always a sort of like I am like big on elite theory, right? Like I think that these like highly placed people in the field, these editors, um, who have these jobs are picking to their taste because that's what they're hired to do, right? And so they're trying to advance a template of authors that are in their style and to their taste and to make that taste for other people, right? And so the thing that's really changed in the last decade is the not just the advent, the mainstreaming of independent publishing, right? People can just go on Amazon and they can put their own stuff up there. And if they can promote it themselves, they can bypass that whole mechanism, right? Now that requires a different sort of elite, a different set of skills, and the author has had to sort of reimagine him or herself as an entrepreneur in a way that wasn't true. Like Harlan Ellison could afford to be a jerk, right? Like man, that's a really tough character to pull off these days.
Hmm.
Like if you're trying to get people to say buy your books through your YouTube channel, you can't just say actually everything is terrible and I hate everybody and all these writers are losers, right? And my readers also are terrible. You can't do that. You can't be Harlan Ellison. Um, darn, right?
His
Not that it's
stories are great, though. You
he's
have to
so good. He's so good, right?
brilliant.
But he could never like hack it as a a social media influencer, right? Selling his own books. It would never work, right? He couldn't. That character can't exist anymore, right? I'm only picking on him because he is like I mean he's a legend, right? Um, but like the circumstances have changed. So the character of the writers needs to be different, right? But the fact that indie publishing exists at all means that people who wouldn't be picked by any of the available editors, and there aren't that many. Publishers are small and there aren't that many of them, right?
Mhm.
A big science fiction publisher might have 5 editors, right? A big
Wow.
one, right? Most of them have one or two. And I'm talking about like the ones you've heard of. I'm talking about like Daw Books, right? My publisher, right? It's Michael Moorcock, that's Patrick Rothfuss, that's Mercedes Lackey, CJ Cherry. Like these are like important writers in the last 50 years, right? And they're the product of Donald Wollheim's vision, right? Betsy Wollheim's vision, Sheila Gilbert's vision, whoever the editor was at the time, right? And we are experiencing sort of a generational handoff in the editorial class right now. There are a lot of the old great editors are sort of backing out, right? And there's sort of like a little like Gen X bump, like kind of in the middle, but like most of
That's
the
my next
editors,
question. Yeah,
yeah,
it with most of society, it's the boomers have held on forever, and the Gen X, I don't know, maybe it's their fault, but they got skipped over, and then it's millennials with not my kind of millennials usually who take
sure,
over the
sure,
booms.
sure, sure, and uh, that's broadly the same process, right? Is it's
Yeah.
going over to millennials now, um, and so there is a sort of cultural generational paradigmatic shift that's happening within the traditional houses that's just selecting for whatever the interests of those editors may be. Right
Yes,
now, there
Christopher,
is
yes.
there is a
Yes.
big movement towards, let's say, questions of identity, which I find personally disinteresting. I'm not interested in the biographies of science fiction writers, myself included. My life is not that interesting. I want to know about ideas, so I'm not
Are
interested
you
in
not
stuff.
Hadrian? This whole time I thought
I'm
I'm
not
thinking about
even once.
Christopher.
I don't even. I have a sword actually. That's a lie. I have several, but that's another video. But in any case,
Yeah.
um, like that is sort of where the like mainline, the successors, if you will, of the Hugo versus Rome, right, are currently on questions of identity. The question really is whether or not that's still Rome or if Constantinople is Rome. And if Constantinople is Rome in this analogy, where is that? Right. And there are a lot of other things going on, right?
Yeah.
Big sort of pulp revival movement on the indie side of things, military science fiction, sort of the successors of Larry Niven and
Yeah.
David Drake and Jerry Pournelle have almost all gone indie as well. There are a lot of small presses that are cropped up to create sort of their own little shared universes. There are all these like little tiny, um, uh, like really like author farm cultures where you'll get like a property that like one indie writer will create, right? And then he will raise up, or she will raise up 6 to 12 little writers to write more stories in the universe. They all sort of ape the Star Wars model, only it's much smaller, right? So you see a lot of that happening. That's really happening with things like space opera and military science fiction. Um, in fantasy too, I had this conversation. I'm friends with Ryan Cahill, right? The traditional sort of epic fantasy has mostly gone over to the indie side of things as the traditional publishing has started selecting more for romance. Um, and that was a very interesting conversation. Um, and so everything is happening, right? It's just a question of in what form and in what
Yeah.
place.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah,
so
Christopher. Oh, go
as
ahead.
the traditional like empire of publishing is dying, it sounds like we should maybe have like set up like one place over here that only focuses on like the hard science, and then another one that focuses more on like the new wave and like the mind kind of stuff, and then eventually it'll grow back into a new empire in 1,000 years.
So I don't think that the traditional model is dying. A lot of indie writers like to say this, that they're like, oh, the big publishers are going away. Penguin Random House is not going anywhere, right?
Mm,
And they have a science fiction imprint, and those people's jobs are reasonably well protected by the big authors that they protect. Because the thing about publishers is they're fairly they operate on fairly narrow margins, right? They don't make a lot of profit, but those profits are pretty guaranteed by their big hitters.
okay.
If you're a science fiction publisher, approximately the size of something like Baynard's Law, you probably have two writers that account for more than half of your income. Period. Right. So you can imagine that's like Patrick Rothfuss and Ted Williams, right? Probably this is an estimate on my part. I don't know Dawes numbers. Account for the plurality of the Dawes income by themselves.
Yeah, it's
Right.
just the law of nature. This is Pareto
It,
distribution.
it's right. It's a thing that's Pareto distributed, right? And so the thing is as
Mantic
long as those
principle.
guys
Yeah.
keep
Yeah.
writing, right? Which is not always true. But as long as they keep writing, your checks are going to clear if you're a publisher. And so the rest of
Mm,
publishing is a gambling project. It's an experiment to see if you can replicate that sort of wild, unpredicted success in
mm,
another writer. And it's just something that's very, very hard to force because you need a lot of these different factors. You need the writer to be good, which is like not a guarantee, even if traditionally published writers, they might be terrible and the editor's taste might be off, right? You need the right cover, you need the right distribution, you need to hit the right time. You need there to not be any like hiccups on the back end. You don't need like the writer to, for example, write a bestseller and then come down with a nebulous disease that like prevents them from working ever again or from dying. Right. So like, it's very hard to replicate a bestseller and to maintain a bestseller, right? But
yeah.
if they're there and they're dependable, then you're fine. And you
Mm,
really only need a couple of them for the company to function. And so the rest of it, you can kind of afford to like, you know, we're far enough into the podcast now to say to piss away the rest of your money.
yeah.
Um, you know, but they do that trying to find whatever the next thing is, and also like pursuing their passion projects. Right when David Hartwell was at tour, right, he was most of his stuff wasn't like big earners. Gene Wolfe is, to my mind, the greatest science fiction writer of all time, but he was never a New York Times bestseller ever. Right.
Yeah.
You know, and so, you do have just these writers that like they do okay, and you keep them around because they're good and because you feel it's important. And there's a certain sense of like noblesse oblige that these companies feel uh is their mission, right? To embetter the culture in some way by keeping these artists in circulation, even if they might not be taking a loss on them, although sometimes they do for a little while or they gamble and lose.
Yeah.
But they might be satisfied with like underperformance on certain parts of their catalog as long as they've got something to buttress. And so,
Yeah.
um, less so obviously with indie stuff. If you're an indie guy and you aren't selling, then you have not quit your day job, and then you can't write as much, right? So,
Mm,
um, so there's there's never been more opportunity is another thing that like bears mentioning. If you like wants to be a writer and you're willing to work hard as possible at it, like you stand a better chance now than ever of being able to get started. But of course, then there's the signal issue. There's just so much stuff. Getting noticed is hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, Christopher, I have a question for you here because, like you, I am a proponent to some degree of, uh, at least descriptively, of Italian elite theory, and I know that you kind of are too. And there was this cliche that went around for a long time. I think it was started by Andrew Breitbart, which was that politics is downstream from culture, that what people want and what they desire and the culture that they make, that politics is then downstream from that. But I think you and I would both agree, Christopher, you tell me if I'm mischaracterizing you, that it's actually the opposite, that culture is in some, I know it works both ways, it runs both ways, but I do believe in many cases that culture is downstream from politics. You look at one isolated, barely relatable example is Germany. If you look at East and West Germany, even today, in East Germany, it's largely secular. It's largely atheistic. If you look at West Germany today, it's still largely religious. Why is that? That's really interesting. Well, it turns out that when you have communism for a really long time and there's a system of state enforced atheism, and everyone's learning in school that there is no God and that this certain kind of warped ideology. Um, okay, well, there's going to be no new churches. Your parents aren't going to have gone to church. You're not going to have gone to church. You haven't been inculcated in that. Your children aren't going to be religious, and it's actually pretty easy to explain that in a lot of cases, culture is downstream from politics, and I found this to be often the case with something like publishing. And yet, you tell me if this is right, Christopher. In many cases, I have so many friends. I interact with students all day. I have colleagues who read. I have a lot of friends who read. And the universal complaint from Mike's Books Discord to all these places I hang out and talk with people is they wish stuff was getting made that they want to read, but it's not getting made. Oh, I'm tuning into Netflix. I wish there was a show that I'm interested in, but there's nothing on anymore because they're not making the kind of content that I'm interested. I think that's starting to change. I think these companies are starting to realize uh, that they have to kind of change their ways. But in some ways, two things can be true at once. As you say, Christopher, you have these you have this expert class. You have these tastemakers and gatekeepers at these publishing companies. Well, these publishing companies are getting smaller. Their profit margins are getting narrower and thinner. And yet there's this taste on the other end that isn't being fulfilled. And that's opening up a space where the indie market can grow. Uh, where do you stand in all of that, Christopher? What do you think is going on there? And do you think that in some sense the elites are failing, the gatekeepers, the tastemakers are failing to understand they're doing a little bit too much uh, cultures downstream from politics because there is this yearning, there's this hunger. A new YouTube channel starts every day that is solely calibrated. You have whole YouTube channels where a guy is focused on criticizing Disney and what they're doing every single day. And that's a cottage industry at this point.
Sure.
Um, do you think that in some sense the elites are failing um, readers when it
Yes. No, I do. I do. Obviously. Now, this is. They're failing some readers. Other readers, they're doing the opposite of that, right? And I think the question is like which readers are we talking about, right? And I think, for example, and I'm preface this by saying that there's nothing wrong with romance novels, right?
Of course
Um,
not. Yeah.
but but if you don't want to read romance novels and the company that had been previously producing epic fantasy novels has ceased to produce epic fantasy and is instead producing hybrid epic fantasy romance novels, and you, for example, uh, don't you don't like romance novels, then you have a problem because the company that you were buying from no longer makes the thing that you want to buy. They stop making sneakers. They only make loafers. And you hate those things. Right? Or whatever. Then you have a problem. And I do think that there are a lot of readers that the current crop of editors either don't want or don't think about. I think don't think about is probably more like I do largely think this is um uh partly explanatory of my own success. There isn't There aren't a lot of 7-book series that are getting made right now because they're actually like very shaky financial propositions, particularly when the books are all 250,000 words long. I am a fool. However, there are a lot of readers who like one series of long books, and the options available, if that is the form factor that you like, regardless of the content, because there are people who are just like, I read long books, right? Um, I'm like one of the only games in town at the moment, and that has had an outsized impact on my reputation, right? I also am writing science fantasy, right? I am writing a science fiction series that like basically has miracles and demons in it, right?
Mhm.
Uh, and um,
And laser
a-
swords, which
and
is really
laser
important.
swords. That's
Very
also
important.
like that is the thing, right?
Yeah.
If you like that, like name 5 other. There it is.
For those
I'll link
for
it. Yeah,
those, watching here, I have Karn Cigar with his laser sword, well, with Hadrian's laser sword, so
yeah.
there we go.
Oh, good. That's the book 2 cover for those who don't know. That's one of my that is I think everybody's favorite cover, but it's one of my
So good. Yeah.
it's so he's so
Number
great.
1 is my favorite cover.
Number 1 is
It
also
it's
awesome.
very good too. I can't find any prints of that because it's different
It's a different
artists that are
artist. Yeah,
yeah.
Sam will sell them, but you have to email him.
Oh,
Um,
okay. I'll see
yeah,
now.
he will sell them, but he doesn't have the little shop preset. Because Kieran did all my other art. We had a conversation. He's like, "Oh, I totally put the prints up, no problem." So he did. But
Yeah, number 1's awesome.
yeah, well, no, they're all. I've been very fortunate in the cover department, but
I cut you off. I cut you off. You were on a
no,
great train
no,
of thought.
no, it's okay. But yeah, basically the point is that I think that I like am serving an underserved demographic here in science fantasy fans. And like, there's obviously look, there's the elephant in the room here too, and talking about romance, right? And that is the demographic makeup of readership, right? Most readers are women, right?
Yeah.
It's like between 2/3 and 3/4 of readers are women. Now, in fantasy, that basically holds true. Science fiction, it's actually kind of the other way. Science
Yep.
fiction is a weird little bubble that's still like mostly dudes. And so, to the extent that the editors are, I think publishing is something like 85% women, like in the houses, right? They are selecting for their tastes, right? And so they're like forgetting about half of the human race, I think, broadly. Now that's not every editor, by no means, right? Um, but the function of an editor, right, is to select their taste, right? And if you have a demographic that's not represented, right, in the editorial class, in this case, men, right? Like books for men, like might not get printed, and men might leave to go read independently published stuff. I noticed that like the big epic fantasy indie writers are like all guys,
Mm.
almost all guys. There are obviously exceptions, right? But there are
But
a
see,
lot more.
that's my point,
Right.
Christopher, is that it runs both ways. In some sense,
Of course, yeah, yeah,
I blame men in some sense. They're part of the equation, which is why don't men read? You know, how come when I go to these backyard barbecues in the summer, I am the only person in the room who reads?
yeah.
And in some senses, the crisis of men dropping out of school, women earning the majority of master's degrees and PhDs and bachelor's degrees at this point, men just going in the opposite direction. So that's part of the equation is men need to get their act together to some degree
And read books, certainly, right? It's
and
also
read
like video
books.
games are really good, man.
I have
Like,
a
Yeah.
poster in my classroom that says real men read. But on the other hand, there's some sense in which part of it is alienation. When you go into Barnes and Noble and this guy who doesn't read too much stops by Barnes and Noble, he buys a coffee at Starbucks and then he walks into the fantasy and sci-fi section. There's nothing that interests him.
right.
And that's a problem too.
This is a chicken and egg problem, right? There right. It's both sides. You're
It's like
completely
the soul and the body. Yeah, it's like
yeah.
interactive dualism, interactive substance dualism, where they
Right.
both
Yeah. That's
interact on each other.
exactly like that.
Can I say so? I found I started reading the Gray Man series because I heard Joe Rogan talking about this, and I
Mark
was like,
Greeny. Yeah.
I have no idea about this series at all. And then oh man, who's Reacher? Uh, I didn't know this, but I started talking with like older Gen X dudes, and they sneakily read Reacher, and
And
I'm like.
Terminal List, that whole Jack Carr Terminal
Yeah,
List
yeah,
series.
Jack I didn't know who Jack Carr was either. Everyone's talking about Jack Carr, and I didn't have a whole ton of these older dudes in my life, and then I started meeting them, and they're like, "Yeah, I read." You know, they weren't like super I read, they didn't put that out there, but when you
That's
ask
what
them,
guys are reading.
they
Yeah.
read it before bed, and I'm like, "Oh, okay, these are pretty like, these are interesting and stuff." I'm more like the philosophical guy where I wanna hear about big concepts, I'll still read someone shooting about, shooting and saving a kid. That's great. But that's what they were reading, and I was like, "Man, I don't know. I better get better at writing, adventure-y type stuff like that because that's what a lot of dudes who do read."
Yeah, and I want to clarify too, right? Like, obviously, there's nothing wrong with uh, like publishing books like for women, right? But all I'm simply saying is I actually think men are an underserved demographic in
Yeah,
science fiction and fantasy,
yeah.
particularly on the traditional side. I don't think editors are looking at books for dudes, as a rule. I just don't
Well,
think it's
that
very
that brings up a question that some of this is therapy for me or helping me trying to,
much.
launch my stuff. I have a very big audience on Park Notes, and I'm also a Christian. So if I marketed myself as another like the only Christian voice you'll hear besides Christopher Ruocchio in science fiction, I think I could sell books independently, and I feel gross kind of about that because I think that is kind of playing off the identity stuff. What if I suck at
Sure.
writing? What if I'm really bad, but I can move stuff because I know how to move stuff because I'm becoming like an influencer? So part of me, like, I am kind of an elitist, maybe in a different way than you guys are saying, where I'm like, I want to get published with a big house. I submitted something to Analog because I'm like, dude, to be in the same magazine that Dune was published in would be, I would put that up on my wall. That'd be amazing. So I still want to believe in these older institutions. And for me, going independent, I think I could do it and be successful, but I would have no idea whether I'm good or not because I think I can move product just because of who I am and not because of my talent. Does that?
Well, one thing I would just quickly say, and then Christopher would have more to say about this, obviously being a Catholic. But you know, Jonathan Haidt once made a distinction that is really important to me, and in my thinking, which is that there is a good kind of identity politics and a bad type. He
Hmm,
says that there is common humanity identity politics, which is what I believe Christianity is when you use Christianity as part of your identity. You know, Haidt says, it's identity politics when fishermen get together and say, we're not being paid enough, or our trade is overregulated, or whatever. That's a form of identity politics. It's one axis of your identity, which is your identity as a fisherman. There's many forms of identity politics that aren't necessarily a negative thing. And then he says there's common enemy identity politics, which is what you want to stay away from. But to some degree, I think you're right. There are people looking to hear storytellers like you, Parker, who come from a certain perspective and worldview and faith tradition. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
hmm,
No, I don't think there is either, right? But to speak more to your anxiety, right? The thing about the art is that it has to and it will ultimately stand separate from you. And it will stand or fall separate, right? You could go put out a science fiction novel tomorrow and you could be really, really terrible at it. And like, sure, you have a large YouTube platform, you could sell few thousand of them out the gate. That's like to get on the Times list, by the way, or to be Times comparable, you need to sell about 8 to 10,000 copies in a week.
hmm,
And you have a large enough platform, you might be able to do that, right? You make it look cool enough, you market it well enough, you provide a long enough lead time, you get the right cover, you could do it 100%, right? Um, but if it sucks, they'll tell you. And some of them might not watch your videos anymore, right? They'll be like,
hmm.
wow, like the facade has crumbled, right? The mustache has come off, right? But, uh, but, uh, if the book is good, they'll stay and they'll stay because it's good. They're not going to read, 8 books or buy 8 books because they like your videos.
Hmm,
Because here's the thing, and I can tell you this like anecdotally, right? And this is like not a dig at my circle of relations or anything, right? When I did my first signing for Empire Silent, um, at Quail Ridge Books, which is my local bookstore. I've done a signing there every single time for every single book. Um, the first signing, there were about 100 people there. I sold 75, 76 books in the store that day. Everybody there except for one person knew me.
hmm,
It was old school teachers, it was cousins, it was friends, it was people my friends brought to help fill out everything, right? And the poor girl who didn't know me, who was there, was subjected to an hour of me reading, from the book, taking questions from everybody I was calling by name. And there's like this girl in the middle who like read the book because she got a arc on NetGalley or whatever. And she's like, "Look, I really like this. This is really cool. I feel like I was at your family reunion. This is really nice."
Yeah.
Um, and the next time book 2 came out a year later, there were about 40 people there, and about 30 of them knew me, and about 10 of them were readers. There wasn't one for book 3 because the world was very sick that year.
Hmm.
And then after that, it has gotten basically to the point where the only family that go are my immediate family, my in-laws, and maybe like if my uncle's available, like he'll show up if he remembers, right? One of my uncles, right? And everybody now is a reader, right? Now my family show was amazing. I'm like they're very supportive. It's all awesome, right? Um, but the people who stayed, and it includes that one girl was the first one. She was there for book 5 coming out. I think she happened to be
Oh
in town.
wow.
She moved away, right? But she came back for that one, right? Like people stay because of the work. They don't stay to flatter your ego, right?
Hmm.
And so you should write the book. And if it sucks, they'll tell you.
Hmm.
And like that won't be a good day. But like they'll stay for the stuff you're doing well. And that won't
Yeah.
change because they're already here.
And I
Yeah.
want to
They're already doing
compliment you
well.
real quick, Parker.
Oh no.
Jump in on this. No, I
Oh,
do.
sorry.
So, no, no, you have a quality that I think is going to enable you to be successful. And that quality is that there are a lot of people that I know who want to be writers who aren't actually interested in writing. They're interested in having the identity of someone who is a writer. One of the things that you're doing really well, I think, is that you have a great work ethic and you just go for it and you're pumping stuff out there, and that's giving you a lot of experience, is that you have a philosophical idea, you're into writing these kind of pulpy, sort of old-fashioned, it's got a quality of sort of half pulp, half new wave, and they're very philosophical stories with a lot of sort of Socratic dialectic back and forth. They're a pleasure to read, and they're really fun, and, um, the thing is that you're not overly self-conscious about it. You're just pumping them out. You're working. You're
Hmm.
honing your craft. The stories are getting better. When I read them, there's a crispness to them. They illustrate very clearly a concept that the story explains and kind of plays with. Gosh, and I was thinking with the last one that I read too. This was about Donald Davidson in the trenches,
Yeah.
Parker.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, you know what would work really well for him, and I think could easily get published, is you could tell science fiction you could tell it would be philosophy through science fiction.
Yep.
So there's a guy who did this a long time ago, several decades ago, named Jostein Gardner, and he wrote a book called Sophie's World.
Mhm.
And the whole book is just an intro to philosophy, but he does it through storytelling, and it's very self-consciously that. He's not trying to hide it, he's not trying to direct it up. It is similar to what Irving Yalom did with When Nietzsche Wept or the Schopenhauer Cure. He's teaching you psychoanalytic principles through fiction.
Hmm.
And the Nietzsche one is a therapist literally sits down and psychoanalyzes Nietzsche over the course of months in Switzerland or whatever. And you could I could imagine you giving us a tour of philosophy, of the big ideas of philosophy that you love talking about, the ship of Theseus problem and the hard problem of consciousness and all of this stuff. Um, and doing so through story and keeping the stories short and publishing a compendium of these stories that are meant to illustrate these very because I noticed this the reason I had that idea was when I read your property dualism Donald Davidson story, I thought this is one of the clearest explanations of how the thinking of Donald Davidson contributed to the implementation of artificial intelligence
Hmm.
that I've ever read. This is such a clear explanation. More people need access to this. And I
Yeah.
thought, wow, he could make a whole book of just these sort of pithy, entertaining little Socratic back and forths with interesting sort of aesthetics. And that would be a really good primer on introductory philosophy. So, anyways, another network of observations there
Yeah.
for you to consider. But
Well, that's the sort of
Thank
thing I
you.
was talking about, right? Is
Yeah.
that story in science fiction in particular allows you to concretize these abstract ideas. People actually, here's the thing. I don't know like how many philosophy professors will believe this, but like people love philosophy actually,
Yeah.
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
They don't know that they do, but then they like go broke watching The Matrix for some reason,
Hmm.
right? Like they like really like want to get their head around these ideas, and you just need the right delivery mechanism. And science fiction and fantasy provide. those mechanisms. And it's not just philosophy, right? It's religion, right? It's
Yeah.
mythology, it's psychology. Stories like, look, this is another feature of like the Golden Age, New Age thing, right? Is that the Golden Age guys were like all chemists and engineers, right?
Yeah.
And then when you get into the new wave, you start to see science fiction writers who are anthropologists, right? Or have a background like Le Guin's parents were both, I think, Marxist anthropologists,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah, they studied Native Americans and stuff like that.
yeah,
Wow.
and like shows, right? It's reflected in her work.
Yeah,
And
Taoism.
what's great about these science fiction writers with these diverse backgrounds, right? And fields of knowledge is that they write very different science fiction stories, right? They aren't just producing, right? This is the opposite, right? We have the opposite virtue of Golden Age, right? It's useful when you have a movement that is like very unified in its aesthetic, right? Because it creates this very lasting impact, right? The Italian Renaissance is like this, right? Like you look at the Italian Renaissance and you know exactly what you're dealing with.
Mm.
It has a look, it has a style. The Golden Age is a look and a style. We don't have that anymore. We're living in a very disunified, fragmented time. But the benefit of that to you as a reader is this sort of richness of experience that you could possibly have. Now, some of those experiences you might hate. You might like try these new writers and be like, this one sucks. Like, I don't want to read anything that's like this sort of like, third wave humanist science fiction. Like, no, but like you might really like cyberpunk, right?
Yeah.
And the thing about now is that you look at any writer, and writers invariably must describe themselves in terms of what has come before, right? They must align themselves with these earlier camps, especially if they're independently published, because they have to put in keywords, right?
Oh, yeah.
To manipulate the algorithm and get their books noticed. And so you must say, you can't just come in and say, hey, I'm writing a science fiction novel. You have to say, I'm writing a, post new wave space opera with like notes of cyberpunk and gothic horror and blah, blah, blah. And be very specific. You start to sound like a sommelier at a Michelin restaurant, right?
That's right.
Describing what is ultimately fermented grape juice, right? Now it's all fermented grape juice, right?
Mm.
But you have to be technical about it. And so you get these writers who are saying, hey, like I'm a cyberpunk person, right? I am like a neo golden age writer. I really identify with the new wave, right? I am like pulp revolution or something like that, right? They
Mm.
align themselves with
Cool.
these old periods become genres, right? This is a tangle I always step in at conventions because we have this argument about whether or not Frankenstein is the first science fiction novel. And it's clearly not because science fiction didn't exist yet,
Hmm.
right? And if the only requirement for what constitutes a science fiction novel has things that we now associate with science fiction in it, then I can go, like George said, back to I can go back to Greek stories, right? Didn't Wait a minute, Hephaestus built robots. Therefore, every Greek pagan is actually a science fiction fan, and the Tragadoya festival is actually a science fiction convention.
Talos is a robot.
And they do
Hmm.
this sort of weird anachronistic colonialism where they're like, actually, these old people, exactly like me, like they're just doing what I was doing. Uh, you know, um, every Greek festival is actually sci-fi. They do this
Yeah.
silly thing, right? Because if Frankenstein is a science fiction novel by virtue of the fact that it has some magnetism and lightning bring people back from the dead, and that's science, then like we have to go look at Voltaire and Micromegas. We have to go look at
Margaret Cavendish is Drown World or whatever.
yeah,
Yeah.
we have to go look at Kepler's Somnium or
Yeah,
Lucian of
yeah,
Samosata's True Story, right? Where
yeah.
they
Hmm.
go to the sun and the moon, right? Like, and then we have to like we can just decide whatever we want, and they do decide on Mary Shelley, because of her, being a woman, right? And they need science fiction to have a mother, right? But science fiction as a movement doesn't come until the early 20th century. It's even
Hmm.
after Vernon Wells, and to call Vernon Wells science fiction writers is also kind of anachronism, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not bagging any of these writers. I love Frankenstein, right? I love Vern a lot. I think he's super underrated
Me too. Me too.
by most modern science fiction readers. Largely, Wells won their argument, right? It's sort of the Wellesian model that kind of won out. But I love Vern. Um,
Uh,
but
but
but the movement starts later, and all of these little, like I said, these epicycles, right? They become patterns for emulation in the now. And it's when you set out as a science fiction writer, you're a fan of one of these things, right? Or five of these things. And what you end up doing, and this is what I did, and this is like the largest bit of criticism I get too, is you end up alloying all those things that you liked together to create this identity for yourself as a new science fiction writer. And it might take you a minute to like really synthesize your voice out of that mixture, right? But you end up doing that. You align with these elements of science fiction past to create science fiction future. And that's sort of why everything is happening at once in the genre now, because everybody's doing this, but their mixes are different.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
and
it's interesting, Christopher, what you said made me it called to mind. I was reading Descartes. I don't know why I was reading Descartes, but I think I was about to
'Cause it's the
teach.
best, man. This is good. Yes. Hmm.
I think it was from his journals, and he was talking. He said something that sounded like incredibly modern. He said something to the effect of, and I know I'm adding in my own bits here, but he said something to the effect of it that it is impossible. And this is a very ironically because Descartes was not an empiricist. He was, in some sense, what a rationalist. Descartes, but he said something that was very empiricist, very Locke, very Hume. He said that it's impossible if you try to sit down to create your own fantasy creature or your own made up imaginative creature, um, it would not be possible to create an entirely new fantasy creature because all you're really doing is cobbling together the bits and pieces of all the animals that you've seen on planet Earth. And so in some sense, it's not, in some sense, you could even argue the song isn't new because you've heard all of those notes before and you're just putting them together in a new arrangement. But I do think to some degree what you're saying, Christopher, is true. And it almost produces a kind of there's something that I think you would agree with this. There's something that we do actually lose when we get more choice. I remember when my wife and I went to the British Isles, England, Ireland, and Scotland. One thing that we noticed when we went into the grocery stores, and we went into a bunch of them, is you go to the aisle, like in America, there's like a chip aisle. There's a grocery store, and every single grocery store has 1 to 2 aisles that are devoted to nothing but 1,000 different types of chips. Okay, we go to Ireland, we go into a grocery store, and there are 3 different types of chips, and everyone eats those 3 different types of chips. In America, you go to the almond section. There is regular, unsalted, sriracha, habanero, smokehouse. There's a million different types of almonds, and I sit there and stare at them for a half an hour because I don't know what to choose. In some sense, we're in. I think maybe tell me, Christopher, if you agree with this. We're in these sort of era. What did Mao say? Let the era of letting a thousand flowers bloom. I think we're in that period, and there are benefits to that, and there are probably drawbacks too. There's a sort of like the tyranny of chaos versus the tyranny of order. Um, I find it to be aesthetically overwhelming to some degree,
yeah,
but
we've talked about the advantages here, right? The advantages that I had this conversation with Kevin J. Anderson, right? We're talking about metal music. And because he's also a fan, and he was like, "This is the best time to be a metal fan of all time, right? If you like nothing but Scandinavian chick metal, you can listen to nothing but new Scandinavian chick metal for the rest of your life, and you will never run out, and that's great."
yeah.
And then the counter to that is like, okay, like name the five greatest metal bands right now, right? And nobody can agree, right? This is that Tower of Babel thing I was talking about. There is no common culture in science fiction or at all, right? There has not been a Game of Thrones since Game of Thrones, because
Mm.
I broadly think there won't be because there are too many streaming services and there's too much being made for everybody to sit down on a Sunday and watch the same program. I don't think America or the world is going back to that model. I've been
Well, it's
watching.
like the same way, Christopher. We're not going back to the media model of free major news networks,
Right. Well,
NBC,
that's what I was
CBS.
going to say. I've been watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood with my daughter, who's, 1, and she needs to watch something. And like, we do not live in that world anymore. That America is dead, actually. Right. And I was just thinking about like, all the kids in America like grew up with this guy, right? Because like, my daughter waves at him when he comes on the screen, right? And like that is an experience that like most of the children her age now like don't have, right? They don't wave at the same guy when he comes on the TV every day. And like everybody's talking about, I don't know, shoes. Right. And that's the fact that that isn't there, that there isn't this shared experience is largely, I think, the factor that's driving um so much of our dissension, just as a civilization,
Mm.
is that that shared experience is gone. Nobody has anything in common anymore. And this we have this in science fiction too. We don't have nobody's reading the same books. This is why nobody can agree on what the greatest novel of the year was. Whereas that was not the case, right? You talked to my friend Ben.
Yeah.
I have this friend Ben Yallow who has been going through Worldcon since the '70s, and like everybody knew what book was going to win, right? Every year they're like, it's that like because they read every book, right? Because it was a small enough thing, right? This is like the thing, I was talking about, in my first video, right? Wiki Parker, is that there was such a thing as fandom, capital F,
Yeah.
singular fandom. It was a group of people in a place, in a time, doing a thing, right? And that thing was going to Worldcon, going to their local conventions and reading science fiction books and snarling, maybe not so much at Star Trek or Doctor Who, but at Star Wars and whatever else is getting made on the the big screen, right? They're like, that's for plebeians, right? We are the real fans, right? We
I asked
capitalize our
Ben.
name.
Ben said they did like Star Wars. I was really surprised. I was like, "Wait,
Yeah,
what?"
yeah.
He's
I
yeah.
was just joking, but yeah, you
Yeah,
would
yeah,
think
yeah.
they wouldn't like Star Wars, right?
Right.
Although they should because it's great.
Yeah.
At least it was. And RIP. But but the point is, right, is that shared culture no longer exists, right?
Mm.
It's like talking to them, it's like talking to like, the last Victorians or something. They're like, oh, I remember the Empire, right? And you're like watching this fading relic of another universe, really, sort of, you know, uh just going back into the mold, right? Like, um,
Yeah.
it's this whole world and culture and time that's gone.
Well,
And
Christopher, on that point, man, something I talked with Jordan about was like, dude, I'm kind of a romantic a little bit, and maybe part of that's because I don't have to make my living from writing. I think that once you sell your first book, it's probably like really exciting, but then probably also like, oh no, this is not my job, and I don't get to like the artistic expression is kind of, I'm sure it messes with you. But I'm like, dude, the three of us are pretty similar. Like, for me, I'm like, I'd rather write a book that was closer to you guys so that we could have a community of people who read our stuff and are like jazzed for it, and we can like carve out our own little niche. I made a um foundation joke earlier that Christopher missed about starting ends and coming back together. But like for real,
oh,
like I found like starting a foundation type
sorry,
thing where it's like, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Um, so in my head, I'm like, that would be awesome, dude. And like not to have the same exact thing, but like similar ideologies, I guess, similar like we wanna write similar things and like our audience would like each other. In my head, that's like something worthwhile. That's something
yeah.
worth pursuing. What do you make of that? Is that weird? Or is it
A
like is
similar
that
sense
something
of life too, you could say, a similar
yeah,
sense of life, a similar ethos, a similar aesthetic. Ideology has a
aesthetic
weird
especially. Yeah,
connotation
that's true.
nowadays. It's
That's
taken
true.
as a kind of
Are
negative
you
thing.
proposing like the foundation of like Inklings 2.0 or something?
I would never say inkling. I would never do that though. So many
Yeah.
so many people have
Oh,
thought
I
that
would do
So many
that.
people do that. Yeah, it's always
and
like,
and
don't you like don't do that.
it's Christian apologists calling themselves the Thinklings, and it makes me wanna throw up all over them. It's
It's too
terrible.
cute. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
you
Well,
have
there's
to
the club.
incorporate
That's the one
Patrick.
that Adam Smith and Samuel Johnson were in. So
I
I don't
don't
know
know
the
that I
club.
want to be in a club with Adam Smith. Um,
Well,
kind of a
so,
jerk.
like,
Uh,
the idea of dude,
but
again, I'm an idealist, so I'm like, inculcating good philosophy into a good story is, like, right up my alley, but what a lot of people that I talk with, at least, miss is the art factor of things, and I don't mean, prose as art, I mean, like, art, like Kansegawa art. Like, that modern publishing, I don't know a whole ton about it like you guys do. But I do see the latest Foundation, covers, and they're terrible compared to the old ones. Like, they don't have artists working on them, they have
yeah,
graphic designers.
Jesus, did you see the new Lois McMaster Bujold covers?
Mm.
They're atrocious. I'm
I
sorry, whoever
I
I'm
can't
probably insulting. They're god awful.
I can't comment on anything covers. I don't know.
Any
Was it
modern
Bane
day
that
fl
did that? Can you answer a
I don't know
descriptive and
which
factual
specific one that
question?
you mean, but
You
Bane is Lois's publisher.
You don't know what I'm talking about? Oh
I don't
my
know
god.
which ones you mean. No.
Whoever's listening at home, just go look up the new
Uh,
covers of the Vorkosigan saga.
I broadly
Crime.
feel as though that series has never had good covers, which is a serious crime against humanity because it's one of the great science
So
fiction series of all time.
good. Oh, and
People,
Parker would like it too. That's
oh,
a series that I think
it's
Parker would
yeah,
enjoy.
I
it's
don't know what
really
it's
great.
called. What's it called?
It's called the Vorkosigan Saga, which is not great. It's Vorkosigan.
None of her names are aesthetically appealing or easy to deal with. It's like the Barryar faction and stuff like that. All of the names are a little cringy, but the story is fantastic. You
She's
know.
Well,
Lois
the
is probably the greatest writer of character in science fiction ever.
the
He's
science fiction stories, they used to have weird names like that, right? Like, all of
oh
her
yeah,
kid books are, like, half a sentence, and you're like, "Wait, what?" And now they're all like Christopher, no offense or anything, but they're all like demon, black demon, the demon of Burgosa, they're very similar titles nowadays.
I try very hard not to put any proper names that I've made up into my titles, at least for novels.
Okay.
Because then you have to spell it to people. Uh
Oh, yeah.
and then it gets hard. It's to save me work is why I don't do it.
Well,
I try
I
to
saw some others that were like The Sunbringer, and I was like, "No. Like, stop."
actually I own the word son now. You can't have it. It's mine. Uh but
I cut off your thought again, sorry, I cut off your
No,
thought.
no, no. But hang on. Jordan, what were you saying? Remind me. I had a thing I was gonna say.
I was talking about how great the Vorkosigan saga is and how
Bad joke.
ugly the book
I,
covers
I
are.
I remember now. Right. Yeah, no, so art's gotten expensive is like the big problem. Right.
Okay,
And so this is a practical issue. Book covers now, depending on the artist, so the artists that you've heard of, right? Like Michael Whalen. I don't know exactly what Michael Whalen commands for a book cover. I'd imagine that it's close to $10,000
okay.
for a cover. And he's worth it. He deserves it.
Yeah.
He is
He's
amazing.
he's one of the greatest of all time, right? But they're not going to put that on a new writer's book, right?
Mm.
Um, and and it's not uncommon for covers to cost between 3 and 7.
Can
Five.
you bring your own, Christopher, if I, like, and
I
I'll put
can't.
something. Yeah,
They're more open to that now. This is something. So this is one of those reasons, right? Everyone's so down on traditional publishing, and there are good reasons to be down on it. There are good reasons to be down on independent publishing.
mm,
Too, it's hard, right? Um, but um, but traditional publishers are starting to try things. Um, they're slower to react. They're big, institutions.
yeah.
Even when they're a small company, they're usually owned by Penguin or Simon and Schuster or something, and so the machine of empire is long in the turning, right? But they're starting to come around to trying things. Daw has always taken my cover briefs for all of my covers. They've paid very close attention. So I realize my camera and my screen are at the same time. They've always taken my notes uh, on cover art and who I want on the cover character wise and how I think the cover should be composed. Like to have these singular monolithic characters and not do spaceships was my idea. That was all me,
Mm,
right? And I'm not patting myself on the back for that, but like I'm just saying, like that was all my idea, right? And so like if that did not work, that would have been my fault. And they were willing to go with it. And publishers started to do things like that. You can go in if you have a relationship with an artist or if you've paid for a piece already. That's pretty common with writers who like were gonna go indie, but then they like decided to get an agent and they had this book already together and stuff. I'm friends with Ronnie Birdie and he had a cover already for first binding when he took it to tour.
okay,
It's a great cover. And so as long as the publisher thinks it's good, right? Because there are a lot of independent covers that aren't great. Right? There are a lot of traditional
sure,
covers that aren't great.
sure.
It's a question of sort of negotiating. When I was briefly back at Bain with book 6, I like their I was like, look, we have to keep the covers matching. Well, we need the same artists, right? And they're all like, yeah, fair point. That makes sense. And so publishers are a little bit more open, I think, to trying this sort of thing. At least they have been with me. I don't, lately I've had a little bit more weight to, which is
Yeah,
maybe part
totally,
of it.
dude.
But they have been experimenting. They've been trying different things. But it is a cost thing, and with those new So there are like two thoughts on like how to launch a debut novel. One is to go all in and invest everything you've got, and the other one is to hedge, right? And see where it goes. And hedging is more common for the obvious
Mhm.
reason that it's lower risk. But art is expensive. And so there are like lots of different schools here. One is like do a graphic design cover and just like don't try that hard. And like some of the times those look great. There's a line of Tim Powers books I think St. Martin did that are all sort of monochromatic with like they look like they look like mainstream thriller novels. They've got like a
Mhm.
little thing in the middle, declare as an ankh and a noose, and that's it. And it's a red book and it looks slick. It's very simple, right? Sometimes that works, but I'm with you. I like the paintings. I
Yeah.
think they look better. I think they're cooler. And more importantly, I think they speak to science fiction fans in a way that graphic
Yes,
design
dude.
doesn't.
100%,
Um,
like the old, like, dude, I have them framed and stuff, like the old analog,
yeah, yeah.
like
I've got the original Dune analog right over there with the mountain on my wall.
yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah.
amazing.
And so they
Look
move
at this
that
next
way.
one.
There's some people who want to try they want to try AI, which I think is a mistake. Because I
Yeah,
don't
don't
think
do
science
that.
fiction fans like it.
No.
It's also wrong
Yeah,
to delegate creativity to machines. Um,
Demons.
and that to demons, yes.
demons
Uh,
who've been trained on real artists' work, right? Like,
right. Well, there's also the IP problem, right? It's a whole thing, right?
yeah.
Now, I do think that's something that eventually they'll be able to solve for. I think they'll work around that problem eventually, right? But I still think it's wrong to give a job that people want to robots. If it's a job people don't want, if it's mining cobalt, like sure, let the robots do that. If people want the job, I don't think it should go to a machine.
Hmm.
And I don't think it's responsible of us to delegate creativity to a machine.
No, that's
Uh,
like that's like anti-humanism, right? It's like,
it's very deeply spiritually ill, I think.
yeah.
But of course, I'm an artist, so like I'm obliged to say that, right? Don't replace me. Replace the cobalt miners.
The
Right,
cobalt miners listening are pissed right now.
right. Yeah, yeah. It's not like please,
Why are they listening? They need to
take
get back
take
to work anyway.
take the guns off of us. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
to your
But
just this will make you happy, and I know this is highly anecdotal, Parker. I'm committing anecdotal fallacy, but literally everyone I've ever spoken to, I ask them the same question. I ask my classes this question: Raise your hand if. I ask people at barbecues and parties and different places that I go. Um, would you be interested in reading a novel? Let's say you were interested in the plot. You read the back cover of the book. Oh, that's a story I'd be interested. Would you still be interested in that story? Or imagine it's music, a song. Like, would you buy an album from if it was created using AI or if that novel was written by artificial intelligence? The answer is no every time. Like,
Hmm.
would you be interested in buying that book? Would you sit down and spend 2 weeks reading that book? Would you bring it on the airplane with you? Would you take it to the beach with you? Would you get the same feelings from it? I do find it encouraging you know, uh, despite everything that's going on. I find it encouraging that I have not heard a yes. Oh yeah, no, I'd have no problem. Yeah, I would definitely read a series of oh, it's not Game of Thrones, but it's like Game of Thrones, but it's written by AI. I haven't heard yes to that yet. Well,
Hmm.
let me ask you guys, would either of you guys be interested, become a fan of a certain type of artificial intelligence that produces a certain series of would that still be interesting to you? And to some degree, one of the consequences of this is you have to be you can't be a death of the author guy anymore. But what do you guys think about that?
well, I was never a
That
death of the author guy.
yeah.
But the thing about it that worries me is so no, I wouldn't be good with it. But I have listened to AI Frank Sinatra sing the Evangelion theme song more than once because it's very funny. And so I do wonder about edge cases like that sort of creeping in. Because I know better, and yet hearing old Blue Eyes sing in Japanese is extremely amusing.
I think
Uh,
about Eric Cartman singing, Evanescence, and I've listened to that one a lot. But
right.
I would start the Butlerian Jihad, like, that would be me doing that. I read stories, maybe I read stories differently than other people maybe. I want the philosophical theme. I know you're trying to I kind of believe all art is propaganda, like, I'm kind of on board with Orwell there. What are you trying to propagandize me in? Like Christopher is trying to propagandize me into hylomorphism. And the hylomorphism. I know that. So
Propaganda is not a bad word. There's not a political regime in human history that hasn't had a propaganda wing.
it's and it's
Um,
it's 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 didache. It's teaching, right? I'm trying to teach you something. I have certain experiences. I'm pouring those into my story. If it's a good story, it's probably going to have some of my experiences. Otherwise, I probably won't be able to describe that event very well, or something like that.
I
I've
call it
lived in this world.
mythos. You call it propaganda,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
to me, it's mythos.
But, like, dude, I don't wanna get propagandized by an unthinking thing that's, predictive text, autoregressive text generation, and behind that is, like, the worst canard of capitalism. This guy just like, "Mm, yeah, that's right." He doesn't even know what the story's about, but he's
Right,
the one,
right.
and I'm like,
All it
"That's
is
horrible."
is a thing to sell, and there's this
Yeah.
impulse in human beings too, right? I've met a lot of authors who write not because they feel called to write, but because they need something to market, and that's
Yes.
easier, technically easier, products to create than a film. Um,
Mercenary, right? It's like, it's just gross. I don't know,
Yeah,
man.
that's the thing. And there's a thread in the conversation that got dropped about this, right? That was about like, I want it to be about art, right? And
Yeah.
I don't want to compromise my artistic vision because it's like now a job or something. And it's never, so it's weird. For me, I have never felt my vision compromised by the fact that this has now become my profession,
Mm.
right? I'm pretty comfortable like not really caring what my readers think about my narrative choices when I'm writing. I have a lot of anxiety after the book comes out.
Okay.
Because I worry that like I will have made a move that causes the readers to disappear. But I in writing always feel like I'm making the decision for the right reason. Right. I'm not thinking about like how are people gonna feel about this because it's like it's difficult to compromise artistically for me because it doesn't like follow to like suddenly do something midway through the story when the logic of the story is leading one way to like do a thing that's going to make readers happy because you want
Yeah.
to make them happy because then you have to like do more work to make it fit
Yeah.
and it just um weirdly my own laziness and trying to want the story to be coherent prevents me from doing anything other than what must be right
Hmm.
narratively speaking um and, because I don't wanna, like, have to justify this crazy thing you want me to do now, readers, right? Um, but, um, but there is, I think, there are a lot of weird dangers, I think, for artists generally. You can, like, disappear in your work and like that, and, I can't quite remember why I wanted to drive back to this point, right? But,
Art,
but
mercenary, keeping it art and keeping your artistic vision going.
yeah, I guess all I'm trying to say is I think it's very possible. Oh, this is it, right? In a climate where everything is being written at once, right? And everybody can has their specific taste, and there's never been more readers actually than there are now, right? In terms of gross numbers. This is the big lie, like, and nobody could read 200 years ago, right?
Mm,
Um, most people can read now, and there were more readers in terms of gross number than at any
yeah.
point in human
Yeah,
history.
yeah, yeah.
So the question is getting their attention, not their existence. Reading has never been healthier just in terms of gross like words processed by human attention than now. This is the best time to be a writer because there are more readers now than ever. And so the question is simply finding them. And you don't have to compromise your soul to find them. You do not have to do it. You do not have to um take editorial direction that you find unpleasant. You don't have to sell your soul. You will notice that I will say only, you will notice that my road through publishing has been a little bit complicated. I lost a publisher. I got another one. I got like bought back. Um, there may be reasons for this, right? Things are really cool now. They're really, really great. Everyone's awesome, but you don't have to compromise your artistic. You can tell people no. And this is true of like any form of art. You don't have to take a deal that you feel, uh, you know, dirtied by or made smaller. You should never do anything that makes you feel smaller,
Mm,
right? Artistically or at all, right? And you don't have to do it. It's possible to create the work that you want to create in the way that you want to create it without prostituting yourself. You don't have to. You can just say no. and it might be slower, it might be a harder road, um, but you can still do your thing.
I like the Jordan Peterson maxim of never say anything that makes you feel weak. I'm sure there'll be a couple of people tuning out because I even referenced him, but
Yeah.
for me, it's kind of it's similar to the Solzhenitsyn maxim that tell the truth or at least don't lie.
Mhm.
I totally agree with that, Christopher. Nothing's worth it. Nothing's worth your soul. So yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
oh, go ahead, Burgers.
well, I'm don't lose that thought. I'm battling, like, the inner, Douglas Adams. I heard something about Douglas Adams when he was writing Hitchhiker's Guide, where he said, like, on every line, he's like, "Please like me. Please like me. Please like me." And I'm like, that makes me wanna throw away your book, dude. Like, honestly, that's gross and weird. But I'm also like, I know other people who are like, "I am the most creative person in the world, and if the world doesn't know it, then that's, all the worse for them." It's like, well, obviously, that's not good either. Like, there's gotta be some kind of middle ground, and I don't know if there's any formula for, like, give up this part of your stuff and don't give up this because this is the core. This is what makes you unique, but, like, you need to shave off some edges, and you do wanna sell books, so it has to be a wide enough readership, like, there's that balance with most things, right?
To
But
some degree, it makes sense that I'd never heard that about Douglas Adams, but again, he's a comedic writer.
mhm,
If you spend a lot of time listening to comedians talk or do stand up,
yeah,
that really is, their job is to make people laugh. And
yeah,
so rule number 1 is people have to laugh at your jokes.
yeah,
And, so in some sense, it's good that they care about that, but I think you're worried about your integrity and your
right,
overall artistic vision as well. I actually think you can do both. It might be a tightrope to walk sometimes, but I think you can do both. I mean, Christopher is a really great example um, of someone who Christopher writes about the things that he cares about and the things that he believes in without having it dominate or overwhelm the story. He's asking in Sun Eater throughout all of the books these questions about what it means to be human, the balance between order and chaos, Gnosticism versus materialism, as you talked about, the imperial political order versus the sort of Lothrian communist regime. He's asking questions about fatherhood and innocence
giant
and aging.
crabs.
Giant
Yeah,
crab.
it's a very, but it's, yeah. So there's the giant crabs and the high matter swords, and
Yeah,
there's the pew pew stuff that the pulpy sci-fi people like, but he's building in that philosophical infrastructure in a way that is not heavy-handed and in a way that's elegant rather than didactic or overbearing. And trust me, if you're a thoughtful person like Parker or me or anyone else who comes to fiction, as you say, Parker, because you care about ideas, that's going to be in there. But you're
yeah,
also going to get wined and dined a little bit too. So
Well, I wasn't looking for the pitch there, but I appreciate it.
uh-huh,
I only I only really, you know, move down the road because I want to encourage people here. Because I know there's a lot of fear about like, well, the editor is going to tell me to change things. The answer is yes, right?
yeah,
But you like don't have to take these suggestions for how they change it. Often, when an editor says, "Hey, this doesn't work," right? Their solution actually sucks because they haven't read book 7 in your head yet, and they don't know
mhm,
where it's going. But the fact that they identified a problem is maybe an opportunity for you to do better, right? And you can look at it and say, oh, like I have a better idea now because they called out this specific thing that I wasn't looking at, right? Now, how would I, the author, solve this problem,
I love that.
right?
Yeah,
How could I make this a bit better in a way, maybe totally independent of of the editor's feedback? Because the editor's feedback might actually be useless, and sometimes it is, right? But I want people to understand this other thing too, right? Which is that if you want to be a writer, and you want to be successful at it, the barrier is not as high as you think, right? Look, I support a family of 3 now. I'm the only person bringing money into the house, right? And I have 4,000 people on my mailing list, and I have 6,000 YouTube subscribers. So somewhere around 5,000 readers is like enough to have a house in at least the not so expensive parts of the country,
mhm,
right? And like you could do that. 5,000 people is a lot. It is not 5 million.
yeah,
You can do it. Like you have way more YouTube subscribers than me, Parker. Like
hmm,
as you identified, you could sell some books, right? Like, not to be just you, but it's anybody watching, right? Like, it could be slow. It's taken me 6 years to get here, right? And that's working like all the time. And I had, 3 jobs for something,
Yeah.
right? And now like also a baby, right? And it's not easy, but like it's possible. You don't have to be on the times list, right? You don't have to, negotiate for pieces of your eternal security against against agents and editors and publishers goals. You can write a story that you want to write the way that you want to write it. You should approach it with some humility and say, hey, I'm not perfect, right? Because you're not, nobody is, right? Like Tolkien edited The Hobbit, that you've probably not read the original edition, right?
Mm,
Gollum originally did just show him out. Um, you
mm,
know, because the ring was not the ring yet. So like you could change things. And that's okay. But you also the bar isn't that high. Like, it is high, like, to be able to provide for speak. You could do it in a way that like, covers Christmas presents or vacation. Like you can, you can make money doing it. It's possible.
But
Um
you also,
the re-
Christopher, have to have people around you that will tell you the truth too. So
that's
just to
true.
add a quick thing in on that, isn't that true as well? That it's also, yeah, you have to have epistemic humility and understand what your limitations are, but you also have to have people looking at your work who are going to tell you the truth and who aren't there to flatter you or just tell you things you want to hear.
Yeah. No, and that's not easy, right? And that's one of the advantages of traditional publishing is there are people who are salaried that I don't pay who are able to tell me that, right? Sometimes they're better than others. That's still true, right? But
mhm,
if you want to be an indie writer, like there are people who provide developmental editing services, who are really, really good at their job and who are affordable. Um, you know, and Jordan, you found this pretty quickly. You put up the first chapter of your book and you said, I would like beta readers, and you like found a whole bunch of people volunteered for you, and like a couple of them were good, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I
Like
got
you
like
have
7 offers and like 2 of them were really good. And then like it was Matt Bialer who said, I wanna look at this again, but you should probably get a developmental editor. And if Matt Bialer read my whole book and said there's problems with it, there are problems with it,
mm,
and you
sure.
have to be, like, honest with yourself. And so I hired AP Canavan, Critical Dragon, because I
Uh,
knew he had done Philip Chase's book, and we just got our feedback back from him. And what I loved about him is he is so smart, and he literally identified any problem that anyone could possibly have with the book, and he told us he was gonna do that. He said, ignore as much of this as you want. Pay attention to 2/3 of my advice, half of my advice, a third of my advice, but I'm going to tell you what anyone could possibly see as a problem or an issue in terms of the readability or the flow or the entertainment aspect or how your book hangs together, all of that. And he did. It was red pen everywhere. But now I've got options and I do, kind of have to go back to the drawing board because he said so many things that he was so profoundly right about so many things. And it was humbling, but it was also like, I am so glad I hired him
mm.
because I don't have to fully go back to the drawing board. I'm going to keep 75% of the book, but I know what to cut out now. I know what to add. I know how to streamline it. Uh, Christopher's right. And his rates were very reasonable.
Mm.
So,
yeah, and there are plenty of people who can do that, right? And so you have to do some research, right? And that's an insurmountable problem, right?
Yeah.
That the problem with publishing, I think that most people have is they just don't know what they don't know, right? And there are resources out there online. There are YouTube channels, and there are places that you can, like, you want to find an agent. Querytracker.net has like all of their contact information and what they're looking for,
Mm.
and you can go there, for example, right? I'm not so good at the whole editor thing, but like those resources exist, and you can do it. And I'm not saying that it's hard, that it isn't hard, right? You could totally fail at it. You could fail at it for years, right?
Mm.
Um, but it is possible, right? It's not an impossible dream, right? It's not, it's a lot easier being an astronaut, right? And you could you could maybe do it, and you should try
Yeah,
if you want to. So
yeah. Well, I wanted to end this with telling you to like how you've encouraged me and hopefully, pointing my audience to you guys even more.
Oh,
Um,
geez.
yeah, so sorry guys, it's gonna be a little embarrassing for you, but Christopher, man, dude, in reading your books, I've seen okay, let me hedge this because sometimes people will tell me they really like my podcast and they think they can do it too. And it's almost like an insult where it's like, are you telling me I'm good or you think you can do what I do better than me? It's like that. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying like in reading your stuff, I've been encouraged to write my own stuff because I see, oh, if I were to write, I would want to write like you. And someone's actually doing it and being successful. So let me try my hand at it as well because you're like paving the way kind of thing. So I've been really encouraged by that. They're just good stories. When my daughter was born, I'd have to go to shop at night for groceries. I got sucked into it. Everything changed. So I'm like 10 at night. I'm out there grocery shopping. I always listen to Sun Eater. First series I've ever listened to. Usually I'm a reader. So every time I go into Walmart, I think of Hadrian now, and he's like deep in my head in every aisle. It's hilarious. But one thing that was really encouraging was you saying how you grind out the book. You're like, I get up at 5. If I can write this many words, 1,600 words or whatever, then I feel like it's good. And that was so refreshing because so many people have the idea of a creative genius who goes for months without writing and then has a wicked spell and they're probably drunk or they're on cocaine in certain authors
Yep.
case. So
And
Muses.
that's yeah, that's been encouraging. So Jordan was saying that I'm putting stuff out. It's because you're an example, man. So I really appreciate that. Along with all the art, all the stuff that's coming out right now. I wonder if you're like, oh, maybe this is too many projects. It's definitely not. Like we need more Sun Eater art. We need other people doing fan art too. I think we need way more Instagram fan art from Sun Eater. So if you guys are out
one
there,
day, one day.
yeah, let's go. So that's been
Yeah, thanks,
really
man.
encouraging. And, Jordan, man, like, the way you describe how I write is a way I couldn't even describe it, but that's what I'm going for, like that pulp and new wave. So I appreciate your like your really keen eye, dude. It comes through in all your videos. You have really good like I don't know if you edit your videos yourself, but you have really good editing as well.
Thank you.
Is that you doing that?
Yeah, it's me, and my wife's even better at it than I am, but she is developing a course this summer and hasn't been able to put out really any content because it's been
Oh wow,
so overwhelming. But yeah, I care deeply about aesthetics. And I know that the aesthetics are almost as important as the ideas. Christopher, you and I have talked about this, but so that's why I put a little bit of extra elbow grease into the editing because I actually think people do care about that.
100%.
There are I
Especially on
know,
YouTube.
like, I know of a bunch of people, I won't name their names, um, that are really brilliant content creators, but they don't have an audience and have never had an audience, and they've been doing it for years. Not any audience. I mean, like, I know people who have put out 500 videos and still have 450 subscribers, because they don't have a camera, they haven't, and these are people that can afford these things, but they don't care about as aesthetics as much as I do, so they don't put out thumbnails for their videos. People really care about aesthetics, so yeah.
Yeah. Well, it shows in yours, man, and I just think that you're like this undiscovered gem where it's like it's gonna you keep putting up the kindling, and when the fire catches, people are gonna be so excited to see so much of your stuff is
I
already here
hope
to watch.
so.
Yeah, man. I know it's a wild, like, game of chance on YouTube.
I
It's
love
so
doing it
stupid.
though, so I've said this many times. I just like doing it. And yeah, you don't wanna speak to no one. You wanna have
Yeah,
an audience, you want
right.
people listening, but I'm not going to stop doing this because it's continued to be fun. It's
Yep.
never been boring, it's never disrupted my life. I just really like doing this, so I'm gonna keep doing it. If you build it, they will come, and,
Yeah, man.
um, it's a little niche little corner of the, booktube world, so
Yeah.
hopefully.
Yeah, and that's the secret. You have to really like it, right? Like even when it makes you miserable, you have to like it.
That's right,
Like
dude, and it
I
will.
was yeah,
Miserable.
it's I obviously am the expert on this, but like it's like
Yeah.
exercise, right? Like it hurts, right? But
Yeah.
it's also fun, right?
Feels
Yeah.
great afterwards.
Right, it's my wife always makes fun of me because I'm frequently just immiserated by because I'm in the middle of book 7 now. I am not like a fun person to live with at the moment.
Mm.
And she's like, "Why do you do it?" Like, "'Cause I love my job." She's like, "You don't though." And I'm like, "You don't
Yeah, yeah,
understand."
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
It's like wrestling, dude. Yeah, people are like, "Oh, is it fun?" Like, "No." Like, "Why did you like?" I have to. It's who I am. I need to do this. Yeah. Well, dude, I hate YouTube, but I love YouTube because I get to meet people like you, both of you. So I'm glad to be like in this kind of little community that we had so far. I hope it continues to grow.
Feelings
Not
mutual.
Yeah, not too many more people added to it, unless we'll see. But um, no, I really appreciate both of you guys. So thanks for what you do, and thanks for encouraging me, dude. I'm a different guy now because of you two. So that's been fun.
Thank you. Thanks for having us on.
Well, hey, the feeling's mutual. So,
Thanks, man. Well, I'll put the links in the description for these guys' YouTube channels. You can find more from them there. That's going to do it for now. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.